The first hint of morning had barely touched Portland when the house began to shift in a way Helen Pierce recognized instantly, even half asleep. It wasn't the sound of footsteps or the creak of the old Craftsman floors. Gerald had learned long ago how to move quietly when he wanted to. It was his breathing, a subtle, strained rhythm, clipped and uneven, as if he were trying to swallow panic with each shallow inhale. In the dimness of their bedroom, it sounded almost foreign. Helen did not open her eyes. She didn't need to. Her mind registered the change long before her body did, and an old instinctive stillness settled over her. She remained motionless on her side of the bed, one hand resting lightly on the cool expanse of empty sheets he'd vacated. Her face was calm, almost frozen, as if sculpted into an expression that could not be startled, shaken, or broken anymore. Behind her, Gerald moved with an urgency he tried and failed to disguise. He pulled on the clothes he had placed on the chair the night before, jeans, a sweater, and the jacket he wore when he didn't want anyone to notice him leaving. He didn't turn on the light. He didn't pause to glance at her. Every movement was stiff, mechanical, touched with the kind of nervous excitement that blooms only in men who believe they are about to start a better life, far away from the one they built. His heavy old suitcase, scuffed, buckled, familiar, waited by the bedroom door. He lifted it with a grunt, the sound muffled but unmistakable. Then he slipped into the hallway, pulling the door closed behind him with a careful, practiced hand. None of it startled Helen. None of it surprised her. She lay in the dim silence, listening. A moment later came the soft, hollow thud of the front door shutting. The air in the house shifted again, lighter now, emptied of his presence. Helen finally opened her eyes. The room was still half dark, washed in the pale blue of a Portland morning not yet formed. She rose slowly, without hurry, as though her limbs were guided not by emotion but by certainty. Crossing the hardwood floor, she drew back the curtains and looked down onto the street below. Gerald's SUV was parked under a street lamp, its windows reflecting the gray drizzle beginning to gather on the glass. She watched him emerge from the shadow of the porch, lugging the suitcase to the back seat. He didn't look toward the house, not even once. He slammed the door, climbed into the driver's seat, and pulled away from the curb with an eagerness that said everything he never voiced aloud. Helen's arms folded loosely across her chest. Not a single tear formed. Not a tremor touched her jaw. All she felt was a quiet, numbing stillness that settled over her like the morning fog creeping through the neighborhood. For a long time, she simply stood there. 30 minutes later, her phone lit up on the kitchen counter. A single message. She walked over, tapping the screen with the deliberate grace of someone who already knew what she would find. The photo filled the display instantly. Gerald on a plane at Portland International Airport, leaning into the frame with a ridiculous half-smile, kissing the cheek of his 20-something assistant, Rachel Torres. Rachel's expression was smug, triumphant, as if she believed she had stolen something meaningful. Beneath the image, Gerald had typed, "Goodbye, Helen, I'm leaving you with nothing." Helen stared at the words. 1 second, 2, her face, at first unreadable, shifted by a single degree. The corner of her mouth lifted, not in amusement, not in heartbreak, but in something colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. A faint, chilling smirk. Because what Gerald Pierce didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined in his most desperate calculations, was that 15 minutes before he carried that suitcase out the door, while he was still fumbling with the zipper and rehearsing his escape, Helen had already made a phone call. One call. A quiet, deliberate choice that would unravel everything he believed he controlled. The photo did not break her. It confirmed she had been right on time. Days before Gerald ever lifted that old suitcase, Helen had already begun to sense the shape of his betrayal. It started the way many quiet revelations do. Small details, almost nothing at first. A perfume she didn't own lingering on the collar of his jacket. A restaurant receipt tucked sloppily into his pocket, marking a table for two at a place she knew he'd never take her to. Late nights justified by talk of potential clients that never materialized into names or invoices. Helen tried, in the beginning, to convince herself these were coincidences, but each new trace formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. And one evening, while Gerald showered, she reached for his phone, not impulsively, but with a steady hand guided by something deeper than suspicion. The screen was unlocked. Messages waited. She opened them. Rows of conversations with Rachel Torres unfurled like a wound. Photos, explicit comments, Gerald's voice messages dripping with crude affection for the young assistant. And woven through all of it were lines that cut sharper than infidelity itself. She's dead weight. Once I drain the account, we're gone. She won't see $1. The business will fold without me anyway. Helen's breath did not quicken. Her heartbeat did not spike. She read every word slowly, deliberately, as if examining evidence already expected. The shock had come long ago. This was only confirmation. The next morning, she drove into downtown Portland, the sky low and silver with early winter clouds. She parked outside the Whitmore Accounting Building, a modest 2-story brick structure she had visited many times over the years. Samuel Whitmore had handled the financial side of Pierce Woodcraft's LLCs since the beginning. He had known Helen and Gerald through lean years, better years, and more recently, years marked by attention he had politely pretended not to notice. Samuel opened the door before she even knocked, his white eyebrows raised in concern. "Helen? You look pale. Come in." She stepped inside, sat opposite his desk, and quietly placed Gerald's phone on the polished wood surface. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for sympathy. She simply scrolled to the messages and turned the screen toward him. Samuel read in silence. The crease between his brows deepened. When he finally leaned back in his chair, his voice was low, taut, and furious. "That man is out of his mind," he muttered, "and he's a fool if he thinks he can empty company accounts without consequences." Helen met his eyes, steady and calm. "I need your help. Whatever we do must be legal, clean, precise." Samuel nodded, already pulling folders from a drawer. "Then we start immediately." For the next several hours, they pieced together the evidence. Bank statements showing irregular withdrawals, documentation of unauthorized loans Gerald had taken under the business's name, transfers to accounts Rachel had access to, purchases that had nothing to do with lumber, hardware, or machinery. Each page revealed another layer of misconduct that Pierce Woodcrafts could not absorb without collapsing. Samuel moved with the sharp focus of a man who despised injustice. "If he's planning to run," he said, "you need to protect the company before he burns it to the ground." By late afternoon, Samuel had already drafted the paperwork. They reviewed each document line by line. Signatures, notarization, transfer of ownership, legal repositioning that ensured Helen, who had built the company's early client base and maintained most vendor relationships, would become the sole owner of the LLC. When Helen signed her name, her hand did not tremble. Something inside her shifted, not toward bitterness or fear, but toward a clarity she had not felt in years. The pain was still there, but now it sharpened into resolve, cold, steady, final. As they finished, Samuel gave a slow, approving nod. "If he leaves the country," he said, "everything he thinks he's taking will disappear beneath him." And now, standing in her quiet kitchen after receiving that smug, triumphant photo from the plane, Helen dialed Samuel's number. He answered immediately. "It's done," he told her. "Every transfer is finalized. The accounts are locked. The business is yours." Helen closed her eyes for a moment. Gerald had left just in time for his downfall to be complete. The kitchen was silent except for the soft, steady trickle of hot water hitting the sides of Helen's ceramic mug. She moved with the calm precision of someone who had learned long ago that her hands reacted better to routine than her heart did. Steam unfurled upward, curling in the cool morning air, filling the room with the faint scent of mint. Outside, The Portland drizzle tapped lightly against the window, a muted rhythm that felt almost merciful. Helen wrapped her fingers around the warm mug and stood still for a moment, letting the familiar heat seep into her palms. The quiet suited her. It always had. It was something she had grown used to, first by choice, then by necessity, and finally because quiet was the only space where she could hear her own thoughts anymore. 15 years earlier, her mornings had looked different. Gerald used to sit beside her at this very table, drinking strong coffee and talking about everything he hoped the business would become. Back then, his voice had warmth, his eyes had ambition, and his laugh, rare but genuine, had pulled her toward him with a feeling she once mistook for security. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. The first dismissive remarks were small enough to ignore, a quiet sigh when she offered a suggestion, a smirk when she mispronounced a supplier's name, a curt "I'll handle it" when she tried to help with orders. None of it seemed vicious on its own, but each comment wore away a thin layer of who she was. Over time, the belittling became habitual. "You don't get how this works. You're overthinking again. Just let me deal with the important stuff." He said these things casually, as if stating facts. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. The tone was enough, cold, flat, designed to shrink her without ever making a scene. And little by little, Helen felt herself fading. Not suddenly, but slowly, like the steady erosion of a shoreline. She became background noise in her own home, tolerated rather than cherished. A figure moving quietly through the rooms, careful not to disturb the man who seemed perpetually disappointed by her existence. Affection drained away first, then respect, then the sense of partnership she had once believed in. What replaced it was routine, inefficient, numbing, and heavy. They stayed married not because they were building a life, but because the habit of waking up next to each other was easier than confronting the emptiness between them. When Rachel Torres entered Gerald's life, his cruelty sharpened. He came home more distracted, more irritable, more emboldened in the way he spoke to Helen, as though Rachel's admiration somehow entitled him to disdain his wife. Arguments weren't really arguments. They were performances in which Gerald made sure Helen understood how lucky she was he hadn't left yet. The worst moment wasn't even one she witnessed in person. It came in the form of a voicemail she found by accident. She had called Gerald to ask if he needed anything from the store. He didn't answer. Minutes later, a notification signaled a new voice message. She assumed it was him calling back. Instead, she heard laughter. Gerald's laughter, bright and mocking, a sound she hadn't heard in years. Then Rachel's giggle. And then Gerald's voice, clear and cutting. "Helen, she's hopeless. Barely knows where anything is. She couldn't run a lemonade stand without messing it up." Rachel laughed harder. Gerald kept going. "I swear the woman would lose her own shadow if I didn't remind her where to step." The message ended mid-laughter. Helen remembered staring at the phone, her breath caught in her throat, not because his words surprised her, but because they confirmed the truth she had been trying to ignore. For years she had convinced herself he was simply stressed, tired, worn down by life. But that voicemail stripped away every excuse. Her patience didn't shatter with noise or fury. It fractured quietly, decisively, like a crack, forming in ice, a clean break, a point of no return. Standing now in her kitchen, her tea cooling between her fingers, Helen understood with stark clarity how much of her identity she had surrendered. She had lived as a shadow, an outline of a woman who once had dreams, confidence, and a steady voice of her own. But not anymore. Something inside her had shifted, small but absolute. Not anger, not yet, just resolve. Quiet, cold resolve that sat deep in her chest and refused to move. Her transformation had already begun. The morning light had shifted by the time Helen finished her tea, settling into the soft, muted glow Portland was known for. Gray skies, gentle drizzle, a calm that felt strangely fitting. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Gerald. It was Samuel Whitmore. She answered immediately. "Helen," he said, his voice firm, steady, reassuring in a way only years of loyalty could shape. "I just want you to hear it again. Everything is finalized. All business accounts, operating funds, savings, everything tied to Pierce Woodcrafts is under your name now, legally and cleanly." Helen breathed out slowly, not relief exactly, but confirmation. "And the debts?" she asked. "His," Samuel replied without hesitation. "All of them. The personal credit lines he opened behind your back, the unauthorized business loans he filed for, the $80,000 he took last fall, the additional $120,000 the bank is still reviewing. Every cent is tied to him personally. Not to you, not to the LLC. He'll have to answer for all of it." Helen closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the reality. Gerald had spent years believing himself untouchable, hidden behind a veneer of authority and false competence. But now, the financial wreckage he created belonged solely to him. For the first time in a long while, the consequences were finally pointed in the right direction. "Thank you, Samuel," she said quietly, "for everything." "You didn't deserve any of this," he replied, "but at least now you're protected." After the call ended, Helen stood in the center of the kitchen, listening to the lingering silence. She felt the weight of the moment, not heavy, but grounding, like the first deep breath after holding in too much for too long. She began to walk through the house, room by room. In the living room, she let her fingers brush over the back of the couch, the fireplace mantel, the wooden coffee table Gerald always claimed was his design, though she knew he had done little more than approve the stain color. The room felt different now, not a shared space, not a borrowed life, hers. In the hallway, she paused by framed photographs that once represented a family she tried desperately to hold together. One by one, she took the frames down, stacking them neatly on a chair for later sorting. She was not sentimental today. She was reclaiming. In their bedroom, she opened the closet and surveyed the empty space left behind after Gerald's departure. The hangers he once used swung lightly, tapping each other like faint echoes. Helen didn't flinch at the sight. Instead, she straightened a few items of her own, making space. Not for someone else, not yet, but for herself. Her phone buzzed again. Gerald, then again and again. Each notification lit up with a different tone. Missed call, voicemail, text, spiking in urgency. Helen tapped the screen, not to read them, but to remove them. Block, delete, silence. She didn't need to hear his voice to know what it would sound like now. Panic, confusion, anger masked as entitlement. The sudden realization that the life he had planned, a new country, a new woman, a new future, was slipping through his fingers faster than he could grab onto it. Her phone buzzed once more, another number she didn't recognize. Probably him on a borrowed phone. She blocked that one too. Helen walked to the window and looked out at the rain streaking down the glass. She felt no triumph, no thrill in his unraveling, only a steady readiness. She knew what she'd done. She knew what came next. Actions always create ripples. Financial, emotional, legal. Gerald would thrash against every one of them. He would try to call, to manipulate, to bark orders he believed she still feared. But those days were gone. She had ended them with a signature and a single precise phone call. Helen placed her hand on the windowsill, grounding herself. She wasn't afraid of the ripple effects. She was preparing for them. And for the first time in 15 years, she was standing exactly where she needed to be. The rain had softened to a mist by the time Helen gathered a stack of trash bags from the pantry. The house felt strangely hollow, quieter than quiet, as though something old and heavy had finally lifted. She carried the bags into the bedroom, setting them on the bed one by one. Then she opened Gerald's side of the closet. The sight of his remaining belongings, shirts he never hung properly, shoes scuffed from carelessness, belts he insisted cost more than they actually did not stir sadness or nostalgia, only a calm, methodical purpose. She reached for the first shirt, folded it once, and placed it neatly into the bag. Then another, and another. The rhythmic motion soothed her, each item sealed away like a small piece of a life she no longer wanted tethered to. His jackets, his heavy boots, even the cologne bottle he used far too generously. All of it slipped into the bags without hesitation. The physical act mirrored a deeper release. With every piece she packed, another invisible thread loosened, threads that had once held her captive in routine, in complacency, in a marriage that had stopped feeling like partnership years ago. By the time she tied the last bag, the closet looked almost new, a blank space, a breath of possibility where control had once lived. Helen turned toward the glass cabinet in the hallway next, an old display case that held what Gerald liked to call family history. Inside were photos from vacations, anniversaries, birthdays, moments she remembered differently from the smiling images trapped behind the glass. Moments that had felt forced, rehearsed, or overshadowed by Gerald's sharp comments and colder silences. She opened the cabinet, the hinges creaking softly, and lifted the first frame. Her younger face stared back at her, eyes hopeful, smile earnest. Beside her, Gerald posed, with an arm slung around her in a gesture that looked affectionate, but had felt heavy at the time. Helen exhaled slowly. One by one, she removed every photo from the cabinet. Some she tore in half, the rip of paper loud in the stillness. Others she simply placed face down in a pile. She kept none. These images no longer told a story she needed to honor. When the cabinet was empty, she left its glass doors ajar, an intentional act, a quiet declaration that the past was no longer sealed, no longer sacred. Finally, she walked toward the room at the end of the hallway. Gerald's office, a space she had never been encouraged to enter. "My place," he used to say. "I need somewhere in this house that's mine." The implication had always been clear. Everything else belonged to her only in name. The office was off limits, a sanctuary reserved for a man who contributed less to the marriage than he believed. Today, Helen turned the doorknob without hesitation. The room smelled stale, old coffee, sawdust, and something faintly sour from neglect. Stacks of papers cluttered the desk, notebooks piled in towers, crumpled receipts overflowing from a metal bin. The air felt trapped, thick with the remnants of Gerald's lies and excuses. Helen crossed the room and pushed open the window. The cold Pacific Northwest breeze swept in immediately, washing over her face, rustling the papers on the desk, clearing the air with a crisp, invigorating bite. She inhaled deeply, letting the freshness fill her lungs. Then she approached the desk. His planner lay open, thick with pages stuffed with folded notes. She pulled it closer, flipping through the scribbled entries, receipts from restaurants she had never visited, meeting notes that hinted at unfinished deals, transactions that raised more questions than answers, small clues of his schemes, some selfish, some reckless, all pointing toward a man desperate to impress and deceive in equal measure. Near the back of the planner, she found something more pressing, a major client meeting circled in red ink, scheduled for the next day, a partnership Pierce Woodcrafts needed to secure in order to recover from the financial damage Gerald had inflicted. Helen stared at the entry, her expression unreadable. If Gerald had still been here, he would have walked into that meeting wearing confidence he hadn't earned. Now he was thousands of miles away, stranded in a life he chose without considering the cost, and she was the owner of the company he had tried to destroy. Helen closed the planner gently, the decision already forming in her mind. Tomorrow's meeting would not be missed. The planner rested on the desk for a long moment after Helen closed it, her fingers still pressing lightly against the worn leather cover. The circle around tomorrow's meeting was bold, confident, almost arrogant, just like Gerald had always been when assuming a future he hadn't earned. Helen studied it in silence, her calm deepening rather than wavering. She reached for her phone, scrolling through the contact list until she found the name she needed. Art Pickering, Pickering and Sons. Construction, one of their largest clients, a partnership Gerald had nearly destroyed with his unreliability, missed deadlines, and constant requests for advances. Helen inhaled once, steady and deliberate, then tapped the number. The line rang twice. Pickering speaking. His voice was brisk, no nonsense, the tone of a man who'd been burned by Gerald one time too many. "Good morning, Mr. Pickering," Helen began, her voice calm but carrying a firmness that felt newly sharpened. "This is Helen Pierce. I'm calling in regard to your scheduled meeting with Pierce Woodcrafts tomorrow." There was a short pause, surprise, confusion, then a sigh on his end. "Helen, I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting that appointment to hold. Gerald's been unpredictable lately." "Yes," she said simply. "I'm aware." Another pause. "Is he canceling again?" "No," Helen replied. "He won't be attending. I will." Art's tone sharpened instantly. "You?" "Yes. As of this morning," she continued, each word clear, measured, unshaken. "I am the sole owner of Pierce Woodcrafts, LLC. All business operations, finances, and contractual obligations are under my authority moving forward." For a moment, the line went completely still. Helen could picture him leaning back in his office chair, processing what she had just said. Finally, he let out a long, relieved exhale. "Well," he muttered, "I can't say I'm unhappy to hear that." Helen stood a little straighter. Art continued, voice dropping to a more candid tone. "Look, I'll be blunt. Gerald wasn't reliable anymore. We liked your work, your craftsmanship, your consistency. But every time we tried to finalize something with him, he showed up late or asked for another cash advance. We were considering withdrawing our contract altogether." Helen felt the sting of that truth, not because it surprised her, but because it confirmed how deeply Gerald's negligence had been bleeding the company dry. Yet beneath that sting was something else, something warm, awakening, steady. "You won't have that problem with me," she said. "The company will operate with transparency and professionalism. I can assure you the meeting is still on, and the work we agreed upon can move forward." "That's good to hear," Art said, his tone now cautious but hopeful. "Are you handling the transition on your own?" "Yes," she replied, "and it's already underway." Another silence, this one softer. "Well then." "Helen," he said finally, "I look forward to meeting you tomorrow. It'll be good to speak with someone who actually cares about the business." "Thank you," Helen said, her voice gentler now. "I appreciate your trust." After the call ended, she remained still for a moment, letting the reality settle. The shift in power was no longer theoretical. It had weight. It had consequences. And it had already begun to reshape the world Gerald believed he ruled. For the first time in years, Helen felt the faint, steady pulse of something she thought she had lost: professional identity, pride in her work, the sense that she was capable of building something that didn't require permission or apology. She ran her hand over the clean surface of Gerald's desk, no, her desk now, and exhaled slowly. She wasn't just maintaining the company. She was reclaiming it, and tomorrow she would walk into that meeting not as someone's wife, not as an accessory to a man's ambition, but as the rightful owner of everything he had taken for granted. Helen had just finished sweeping the last of Gerald's discarded papers into a box when her phone rang again. This time, the name on the screen froze her mid-movement. Chloe. She answered immediately. "Sweetheart." What came through the speaker wasn't a greeting. It was a choked, trembling breath, then another, then the sound of her daughter crying in a way Helen hadn't heard since she was a girl. "Mom, what's happening?" Chloe managed between sobs. "Dad just called me and said, you stole everything from him, that you..." that you lost your mind." Helen sat down slowly at the edge of the bed, her expression steady even as her heart tugged at the sound of Chloe's pain. "Take a deep breath," she said softly. "Tell me exactly what he told you." "He said you locked him out of the accounts," Chloe continued, voice breaking. "That you took the business from him, that you're trying to ruin him. I didn't know what to believe." Helen let out a quiet exhale, not frustration, not despair, but a weary confirmation of what she already expected. Gerald was panicking, and when Gerald panicked, he lied, viciously, recklessly, always to serve himself. "Chloe," she said gently, "your father is not telling you the truth." A shaky pause. "Then tell me what is true." Helen didn't hesitate. She had promised herself years ago that she would never burden Chloe with marital ugliness, but that vow no longer served either of them. It was time to lay the truth bare, not to wound, but to free. "Your father has been unfaithful for a long time," Helen began, her tone calm and even, "with his assistant, and he planned to take money from the business and leave the country with her." Silence, then a small, wounded whisper. "Mom." "No. I found messages," Helen continued. "Plans he made, things he said about me, about the company. He didn't just betray our marriage. He financially sabotaged the business. He took out loans under the LLC. He ran it into debt, and he intended to disappear." Chloe's breathing grew rapid again, but this time it wasn't confusion. It was shock, hardening into something sharper. "So when he told me you were the one ruining everything," she said slowly, "he was trying to cover what he did." "Yes," Helen answered. "He is frightened because his actions finally have consequences." Another long, heavy pause. Then Chloe spoke again, but her voice had changed. The softness was gone. "How dare he," she whispered, fury trembling at the edges. "How dare he call me crying, pretending you were the one who hurt him?" Helen closed her eyes for a moment. She heard it clearly, the shift, heartbreak turning into outrage, pain transforming into clarity. "Mom," Chloe said suddenly, determination rising through the grief, "I'm coming over. Right now." "You don't have to—" "No," Chloe cut in firmly. "I need to. And you shouldn't be alone. I'll be there soon." True to her word, less than 30 minutes later, Chloe stood in the doorway of the house, cheeks flushed from crying. Eyes red but blazing with protectiveness Helen had rarely seen directed outward, much less toward her. The moment she stepped inside, she wrapped her arms around her mother with a force that startled them both. It wasn't a gentle hug. It was an anchoring one. "I'm here," Chloe murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." Helen held her for a long moment, feeling her daughter's strength pulse through the embrace. When they finally pulled apart, Chloe immediately rolled up her sleeves. "Tell me what needs to be done." Together they moved through the house, gathering, sorting, cleaning, reclaiming. Side by side, mother and daughter began stitching back a unity that Gerald's choices had strained but never fully broken. By evening, the air in the house felt different, not lighter exactly, but fortified, like walls once weakened had been reinforced with something unshakable. Chloe wasn't confused anymore. She was loyal, fiercely, and this time, Helen wasn't facing the fallout alone. Thousands of miles from Portland under the harsh fluorescent lights of Kahului Airport in Maui, Gerald Pierce stood at an airline counter, shoulders tense, jaw clenched, sweat gathering at his temples. The terminal buzzed with the casual chaos of tourists dragging suitcases, families returning home, and couples starting vacations. But for Gerald, the world felt like it was narrowing into a cold, suffocating corridor. "Sir," the airline agent repeated politely, "the card was declined." That can't be right," Gerald snapped, pushing the card forward again. "Run it one more time." She did. Same result. Declined. He reached for another card, platinum, embossed, once a source of his pride. Declined. Then the business card. Declined. Even the emergency card he never told Helen about. Declined. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, eyes darting across the screen as though he could read the agent's monitor by sheer force of will. "Perhaps you should contact your bank," she offered gently. He stepped aside, dialing frantically. 1 call, 2, 3. All responses automated, all accounts inaccessible. Each attempt carved a deeper line between his eyebrows. He tried Samuel next, straight to voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. "Pick up the phone, damn it!" Gerald hissed under his breath. Samuel always answered his calls. Always. The sudden silence told him far more than any message could. He tried Helen. Blocked. He opened the messaging app. Message failed to deliver. His stomach dropped. From a nearby seat, Rachel Torres watched him with growing irritation. Her arms were crossed tightly, her glossy hair pulled into a high ponytail that swayed angrily each time she shifted. "What's happening?" she demanded. "We were supposed to be on the beach by noon. Don't tell me you planned this whole getaway and didn't check your accounts." "I checked them," Gerald barked. "Something's wrong. This is some kind of mistake." Rachel scoffed. "Everything with you is a mistake lately." Gerald's head jerked toward her. "Excuse me?" She leaned back, arms crossed deeper. "You told me you handled everything. You told me you had money lined up. You told me Helen was clueless and wouldn't touch the business." Her eyes narrowed with a disdain he had never seen from her before. "And now we're stuck in an airport because all your cards are bouncing like we're broke teenagers." "I am not broke," he growled. "Then buy the damn tickets," she snapped. When he didn't answer, when his silence stretched too long, Rachel's expression shifted, from annoyance to realization, a quiet, bitter understanding. "You don't have anything left, do you?" Gerald clenched his teeth. "I just need to reach my daughter. Chloe will—" Rachel interrupted with a short, humorless laugh. "Your daughter? Gerald, she barely speaks to you unless she has to." He didn't bother arguing. He dialed anyway. His last lifeline. The call rang once. Twice. Then Chloe picked up. Her voice was calm. Too calm. "Dad? Chloe, thank God. Listen, something's happened. Your mother, she's taken everything. She's out of control. I need you to talk to her. Make her see reason. This is—" "Stop," Chloe said sharply. Gerald froze. "You don't get to twist this. Not with me." Her tone was cold, steady, nothing like the girl who once scrambled to defend him during arguments. "I know everything. Mom told me the truth about the affair, about the money, about the plan to leave us." Gerald's breath stilled. "Chloe, sweetheart, don't," she cut him off. "Don't call me that, and don't contact us again. You betrayed our family. That was your choice. Now live with it." Before he could respond, the line went dead. He stared at his phone as though it had physically struck him. For the first time, the weight of everything he had lost pressed down with brutal, undeniable force. He had no access to money, no business to return to, no partner who trusted him, no daughter willing to pick up the phone, no wife left to forgive him. And when he lifted his gaze, Rachel stood watching him with the same cold contempt he had once reserved for Helen. Dismissive, unimpressed, utterly finished. "You know what?" Rachel said, grabbing her purse. "I'm not wasting my time on a man who can't even buy his own plane ticket." "Rachel, wait." But she was already walking away, heels clicking sharply across the polished airport floor, leaving him stranded under the humming lights, drowning in the consequences of his own making. Gerald sank onto a bench, hands trembling, vision blurring around the edges. Panic swallowed him whole. This wasn't the new life he imagined. This was the collapse. By late afternoon, the house no longer felt like the place Gerald had abandoned. It felt like a place being remade, slowly but unmistakably, by the steady hands of two women who had spent far too long tiptoeing around his moods. Helen and Chloe worked side by side, clearing out drawers, sorting through forgotten corners, carrying bags of Gerald's belongings to the garage. The air inside the home shifted with every movement, lighter, clearer, less burdened by the weight of years spent walking carefully around a fragile ego. It wasn't just the physical mess they were cleaning, it was the residue of silence, the unspoken apologies, the swallowed reactions, the years of pretending something was fine because any challenge, any disagreement, risked setting Gerald off. At one point, as they folded blankets in the living room, Chloe paused, her hands stilling. "Mom," she said softly, "why didn't you ever tell me how bad it was?" Helen glanced over, her expression gentle but resolute. "Because you were young, and then you were busy building your own life. And She hesitated, searching for the right truth. "I thought I could handle it." Chloe sat down on the couch, brow furrowing. "You shouldn't have had to." Helen lowered herself beside her. "Sweetheart, for years I believed it was easier to stay quiet. Every time I tried to speak up, Gerald treated me like I was overreacting. Eventually, I learned to shrink my needs so he wouldn't criticize them." Chloe's eyes glossed, anger and sadness mixing in a way that looked almost protective. "That isn't a marriage." "No," Helen said softly, "it wasn't. Not for a long time." They sat together for a while, an honest, unfiltered quiet settling between them, not the brittle silence they'd lived around Gerald, but a comfortable pause shaped by understanding. "What do you regret most?" Chloe finally asked. Helen didn't look away. She didn't soften her voice or take time to phrase it more gently. "Not leaving earlier." The words hung in the room with a clarity that felt cleansing rather than painful. Chloe nodded, tears rolling freely now, though her jaw was tense with conviction. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "Not ever again." They finished the last of the cleaning as evening shadows stretched across the hardwood floors. Chloe packed up a few boxes for donation, wiped down the counters, and made one last sweep through the house. By the time she was ready to leave, the space felt different, less haunted by Gerald's presence, more aligned with the woman Helen was becoming. At the doorway, Chloe hugged her tightly. "Call me if you need anything. I'll come back tomorrow." "I know," Helen whispered. "Drive safe." When Chloe's car pulled away, the quiet that filled the house was no longer oppressive. It was gentle, peaceful, alive. Helen walked to the kitchen, brewed a pot of mint tea, and carried the steaming mug to the living room window. Outside, Portland glowed softly, streetlights shimmering in the damp air, buildings casting warm reflections on rain-slicked sidewalks, night settling over the city like a heavy, comforting blanket. She curled up in her armchair, sipping slowly, breathing deeply. Every inhale felt fuller. Every exhale felt like something old and heavy leaving her body. After a few minutes, she rose and retrieved an old photo album from a drawer. The cover was worn, the pages slightly curled, images of a younger Helen, smiling at possibilities she had once chased without hesitation. She traced a fingertip along one photo, her at 28, laughing under a canopy of fir trees on the Oregon coast, wind in her hair, eyes full of the kind of freedom she hadn't felt in years. She didn't cry. She didn't ache for the past. Instead, she reconnected with that version of herself, the woman she had been before shrinking, before silence, before Gerald's slow erosion of her voice. When she finally closed the album and set it aside, the house was silent again. But this silence wasn't a void. It was the first night she wasn't afraid, the first night she wasn't waiting. The first night she didn't owe anyone an apology for simply existing. For the first time in a long, long while, Helen Pierce felt something close to peace. Helen woke the next morning with a sensation so unfamiliar she lay still for a while, quietly observing it, as though it might dissolve if she moved too quickly. Rest. Genuine, uninterrupted rest. The kind she hadn't tasted in years. Her body felt lighter, Her chest no longer carried the tight, invisible knots that Gerald's presence had woven there over time. For a moment, she simply breathed, letting the softness of the morning wrap around her like a warm blanket. A soft knock at the door brought her back to motion. When she opened it, a courier held out a sealed envelope. Mrs. Pierce, documents from Whitmore Accounting. She thanked him and carried it to the kitchen table. Sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating the polished wood where she laid the packet flat. Inside were bank confirmations, ownership transfers, and updated account authorizations, all bearing her name. Not his. Never again his. She signed the final page, her pen gliding with confidence, and exhaled slowly. It wasn't triumph she felt. It was something quieter, deeper. Legal closure settling into her bones. She opened her laptop next. A cluster of new emails awaited her. Samuel confirming additional filings, vendors asking about next steps, Art Pickering thanking her again for the call and expressing optimism for tomorrow's meeting. Helen read each message with a clarity she hadn't felt in decades. These weren't burdens. These were building blocks. Her phone buzzed with a reminder she'd set the night before. Salon appointment, 11:30 a.m., downtown Portland. She smiled faintly at the thought. Something simple, something for herself, something she hadn't bothered with in far too long. By late morning, she stepped into a small salon tucked between a bookstore and a bakery, the scent of eucalyptus and lavender drifting through the air. A stylist with warm eyes greeted her. "What are we thinking today?" Helen touched her hair, the silver strands woven through the darker ones. She used to hide them. Gerald once commented that gray didn't suit her, that she should keep up appearances. Not today. Just a trim, Helen said, but keep the silver. I like it. The stylist smiled. It looks beautiful on you. As the scissors moved, locks of tired years fell to the floor. Nothing dramatic, not a transformation forced by rebellion, but a deliberate step into her own skin. Afterward, instead of heading straight home, Helen walked to a quiet restaurant she'd passed countless times, but never dared to enter because Gerald found it pretentious. She chose a table by the window and opened the menu slowly, savoring the freedom of choosing what she wanted. She ordered a dish Gerald always disliked, and dessert, and tea, her favorite mint blend. When the food arrived, the simple act of eating alone, without judgment or tension, felt like an act of self-creation. As she walked back through the late afternoon drizzle, the city lights beginning to flicker on, she felt grounded in a way she hadn't since her 20s. The streets of Portland, once places she rushed through, now felt open, full of possibility. When she reached home, her phone vibrated against her bag. A missed call from Gerald, then another, and a voicemail. She didn't listen. She deleted the voicemail, blocked the number again for good measure, and placed her phone face down on the counter. His voice, his choices, his consequences, none of them had a place in this new chapter. On the dining table, she spread out her planner and made notes for the week ahead. Monday, meeting with Art Pickering and Sons Construction. Tuesday, appointment with a real estate agent to view an apartment in the Pearl District, smaller, brighter, closer to the things she wanted in her life. Wednesday, visit to Samuel's office to finalize the last legal steps. Each line she wrote steadied her more, anchored her more, returned her more to herself. Later, she stood by the living room window with another mug of mint tea. The Portland skyline shimmered in the wet evening, streetcar lights gliding past, reflections dancing across the pavement, the hum of a city that felt newly alive. Inside the quiet house, she wasn't lonely. She was alone in the best possible way. No footsteps to brace for, no sharp words lurking around corners, no draining presence to shrink beneath. Just Helen, finally Helen, standing firmly in her own life. Her past had unraveled. Her old roles had fallen away. The silence around her was no longer a void but an open horizon. For the first time in decades, her future wasn't an echo of someone else's choices. It was hers, genuinely, unapologetically, beautifully hers.